Curioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast. And today is the Freeform episode where we just kind of ramble and talk a little bit about different subjects over different ideas. And so today, if you've seen our thumbnail this week, if you're looking on YouTube or if you've seen it via maybe your podcast app, the topic of the episode is known as the elephant and the mouse. So, what does that mean? What am I referring to? And what will be the subject today? So, I wanted to talk a little bit about politics, and I've talked about political voting in the past and kind of my dealings with that. And I didn't want to get into that again, so I'm going to slip past that. But I'm going to talk more in a general standpoint of what is the problem for smaller nations when dealing with bigger ones. So, specifically, having lived in two different ones myself, how to identify and how do you deal with that? And how do you explain it to someone who lives in the bigger nation when they're asking you questions, when they want to know more about you or about the place you come from, or maybe in this case, maybe they're not as informed on the place that you're moving to, if you want to use that phrase, and kind of get into further detail about that. So, what does the mouse and the elephant entail, or what does that mean? So, a long time ago, and by a long time ago, I mean 50 plus years ago, one of the prime ministers of Canada mentioned that living next to the United States is like being the mouse in bed with an elephant. You know, it doesn't matter how nice the elephant is or how pleasant they are to deal with. When they move, you know about it because you're tiny and they're big, and anything they do, even from a friendly fashion, can have repercussions in ways that they don't understand themselves in your country or nation. This kind of experience is something I see a little bit in the experience between England and Wales. I think in some ways that England and Wales know more about each other than I think USA and Canada do. I think Canada knows a lot about the USA, but I would counter that by saying, especially up until recently, I think that was almost non-existent to most people. I think the to put it politely, most Americans' knowledge of Canada was very small, probably built mostly around stereotypes. And I think that's changing as, issues have gone on over the last year in 2025, if you're listening to this later. And so I think people are more informed than they probably were before. And I've heard a lot of discussion about it, certainly more than ever before, and more than just the usual. So I'm not going to go into lots of arguments about pluses, minuses, and all the arguments in between, because that's not the point. The point is that the larger nation generally is less informed about the smaller one, or doesn't understand the issues of the smaller one, which I think is more applicable between England and Wales. I think it's not that they don't know each other. It's not that they don't understand that there are differences. Obviously, the stereotypes do play into it, but I think as well, most people have visited each other. Most people know kind of what, at least to an extent, some of the main things are, like the language. It's hard to miss out on the Welsh language when you pass a bus stop, it's labeled in both languages. When you see a sign, it's labeled in both languages. It's pretty clear that there's a difference between the two. And in Canada, it's a little bit less. I mean, there's some obvious distinctions because we have all of our speed limit signs in kilometers instead of miles. So that changes a lot of people's perspective when they come north, because you see it's no longer in miles. Suddenly you're driving in what looks to be really fast miles, but it's actually just kilometers, and actually slower. But I think that's part of it. I think some of the ways that we look at life is a little different, and I think those things can stand out. The predominance of different things. Nowadays, I think actually there's some similarities in the way that due to current circumstances, patriotism is a lot stronger than normal. So you'll see a lot more Canadian flags than you might have, say, 5, 10, 15 years ago, where they were almost non-existent. And I always used to say it. I think I've said it on the podcast before. I always found it funny because when American companies came to Canada, one of their big ways of showing that they had joined Canada was they would put a big old Canadian flag out front. Walmart would do that quite consistently. And it was always very weird because it wasn't something anybody else did. So outside of like government owned buildings, it just wasn't normal. So it was kind of odd. It's become more popular now, but it wasn't a thing that was done then. And it was very confusing for a bit. It was kind of like, oh, okay, you're trying to show your street cred. Is that what this is about? And I remember not long back, and by not long back, I guess this is probably 10 years ago. No, this wasn't, okay. It wasn't that long ago, but there was a lot of discussion surrounding the use of the Union Jack in Wales and how some politicians were wanting to see it more and not less, and while not saying it, kind of wanting to see less of the Welsh flag. And that didn't win them any favors in the area. And I think that's something that I would argue is always a bad idea. And obviously, the Welsh experience is different than the Canadian experience because Canada is not run by another country effectively. It's not a subsystem within the other country, subnation, if you want to call it that. And so we don't necessarily have that same kind of pressure on us, but we do have other pressures which are similar. Cultural pressures being the biggest one, language pressures being a big one. The use of French in Canada is not shared in, say, America. Most Americans, I think most Canadians talk the same way they do, share the same values. And I think largely that's true. And very similar to Wales, I think there's that same feeling between English people that while not the same, they're similar enough that there's not that big of a difference between the two places. And in part, that's true simply because the more dominant side has kind of run the show and enforced their dominance upon the place that their culture or whatever kind of controls. Like the reason why English, as we're going through with the podcast, is more dominant in Wales just comes down to the fact that they controlled the levers of power, which controlled who used what. And the view on Welsh was that it was a lesser or rustic language, if you want to use that term, rather than a language of the people or the language of government. And if you're a Quebecer, that would have been an argument, say, 50, 60 years ago about English and the way it was used in Quebec as the dominant language and forced upon Quebecers to use. And so there was a big blowback as time went on about that. And so in a way, it's kind of a weird dichotomy because of our situation with Quebec being so similar in some ways to Wales, but so different than others because they don't have, because their subnational government is effectively in control of much more. It's a lot easier for them to kind of control the language. And also, there wasn't a complete loss of the language or near to it, right? I mean, Welsh in Wales is still only spoken by a third of the population, and probably even less than that as a fluent language, and less than that are born with it. So we have that extra struggle if you're in Wales over, say, a place like Quebec, where the language was never lost, it was just diminished. Most of the population still spoke it as their first language, still were born with it, still grew up with it. And then they just had to deal with English in all their official dealings. And over time, in the 1960s, that changed. And we reached what's called official bilingualism, wherein French is recognized as an official language of Canada. And if you go into a government center, you must be served in French if you speak French. There is no reason for you not to be served in that language. So you can be anywhere in Canada and, your daily life could be completely English, but if you go into a government center, you expect to be spoken to in French. You're going to be spoken to in French. It may not be great French, but you will be spoken to in French. So I think that's a big difference that Wales is starting to build towards. I think there is a desire to get that, but we're not there yet, obviously. Obviously, the government side of it is more so, but I would argue that the public side is not there. And there isn't sort of a same sort of sentiment about it. So that's, again, that's one of the differences. You can't, one to one other people's experiences. You can't say, oh, because you lived in Canada, you know what it's like to live in Wales or vice versa, which is always interesting when dealing with people who come from other places and they talk about the place you're from and sort of from a grass is greener where you came from sort of thing. It's a bit awkward when you kind of have to say, well, actually, there's a reason why I moved here, and it isn't just because I like this place. There's also negatives in the place I came from. So, and I think that's something we've talked about before. Like you can't make a decision on where you live based on simply, I visited there, I thought looked cool, blah blah blah. I mean, when you're young, I guess you can, but as you get older, you have to make a lot of decisions based on a lot of other things, and you have to accept the good with the bad. There are always good and bad things. If you live in Canada, there's a lot of differences in the way things are done. There's a lot of differences in the weather. There's a lot of differences in simple everyday things that you're used to. Walkability, if you're in Britain, is much different in Canada. The ability to get around on public transport is very different in the two areas. And the size of the country is, of course, being a massive difference. And even if you put in the entire UK, it's still a massive difference. But then again, conversely, the population is so different too. Like my province, which is the size of the United Kingdom, again, I probably said this before, so I apologize, is the entirety of the United Kingdom could fit in it, but our population is the size is just barely bigger than Wales. Like we don't have the same population density. In cities maybe there is, but there isn't outside of it. And so as you look at the land mass, it doesn't share that. And that's something that's very different. So while Wales doesn't have the same density as, say, England, there is still a lot of people in a very small area, even though you can go to lots of areas in Wales where there's no people. So it's a funny little dichotomy of kind of the experience. It's not like England where, it's village to town to hamlet to to farmhouse to, major city, all sort of within kind of a short distance, which you kind of find in England. In Wales, you can go quite a ways and not run into anybody because it's more natural area than there is and farmland than there is, say, in England. So this is something where it's that's why the experience is different. That's why some of the ways and the means of things are different. And the one thing that I think in watching and listening to stuff that's going on in Britain at the moment, and specifically Wales, the one thing I definitely notice is that there is still a lot of struggle built around how do you take and convince people who aren't sharing your experience, who aren't sharing your problems, and convince them that, hey, when you say you're doing something for us, maybe it should actually be done for us and not done either to us or in some cases done without us, because, oh, well, fill in the blank, it's difficult. We don't want to do it. Da, da, da. Think about public infrastructure and kind of how things are built in various places and what gets built where and why versus other places. And there's lots of conversation right now built up around how the railways have been built in England versus Wales, for example, and how that Wales has felt like it doesn't get the same treatment. Those kind of things are important. Conversely, we have similar problems in Canada with our sub-nations, our provinces, where some provinces feel aggrieved over various reasons that are sort of similar. They're not treated the same for different reasons. Some have the money, but not the power. Others have the power, but not the money. There's a lot of different things that go around. Some have natural resources that are very prosperous. Others have no natural resources or very few, or some that they don't want to lean into because of various problems with them, i.e., coal, which Wales is very familiar with. There's been a lot of talk in the past about what to do with the coal that still resides underneath, the mountains in Wales. and specifically about the methane and natural gas that's building up in those areas that could be, through fracking as an example, used as a source of natural gas and brought out and used elsewhere. And again, not to get into a debate about that because it's not the point. The point is that as a smaller subnation, it is important for you to have that choice of what to do. Do you use something that could be used as a financial tool to help make yourself better, or do you look at it and say, from an environmental standpoint, I don't want to use that? There's other reasons outside of simply money that make us decide not to use it. And similar problems exist in Canada. There are, you know, great seams of coal, for example. There is a lot of things that are done to gather natural resources which aren't clean or environmentally friendly. And there is always that debate about, should we restrict that or should we allow it? Especially when partners across the world are like, hey, it would really help us out if you could ship, your resources to us. And we're like, well, we can't actually do that because we don't have the ability to. Not because we can't, but because we've never built the infrastructure to do that. And that's a big conversation that's going on right now in Canada, particularly with the problems that we're having south of us, and how do we make sure that we're not completely reliant on one nation for most of our economy? Something, again, I think Wales is very familiar with, and I think one of the reasons why there's been a lot of debate about the EU and the relationship that Wales had with the EU versus now as a part of Brexit, how that has built up their relationship with the United Kingdom as a whole, and how independent or not that makes Wales feel. Those are kind of emotional arguments which people have, right? Like you have some people who firmly believe that they were screwed over for different reasons and different ideas. They view the other side completely wrong. Context is not always our friend on social media. So there's a lot of argument back and forth on both sides, and that happens, I think, in every country in the world. So it's not new to us or specific to either Wales or Canada, for example, or America or any other place, really. But I think when we look at these relationships that we have with these bigger nations, I think one of the things that really stands out for me is that there is sort of an education that you have to do with the other side so that they do understand your point of view. It's not so simple as to just say, well, why don't you understand me? This has been going on for years. Why don't you understand that this hurts or this causes problems or that, maybe we're not your friends anymore? Those kind of discussions have to be had amongst all sides. And I think largely what ends up happening is people don't realize, either through ignorance or through just simply not really knowing. I mean, people live their lives on an everyday basis dealing with what they have to deal with financially, mentally, and everything else. And people don't always consider what's going on somewhere else. We turn blind eyes to things because it's just easier than trying to think about every single disaster that's going across the world. You know, we just don't know about them. And it isn't because we couldn't know about them. In some cases, it's just because we've decided not to know about them. And I consider myself one of those. I mean, there are things I'm following in the media and in politics that I'm very interested in. We have an election coming up this week as I record. Actually goes out on the day of our election. And that, of course, is important for me to pay attention to. So I'm paying attention to it. Am I paying attention to conflicts in Central Africa? Not really. Have I paid any attention to what's going on in, say, Malaysia or Thailand or Vietnam or take your pick nation in Asia? Not really. Why is that? There's loads of reasons why. And some of it just comes down to the fact that I don't have enough time in the day to pay attention to everything that's going on. And usually it only gets in front of my face when things are happening on a big enough scale that it gets in front of my face. Usually because it's of interest to the public, and so then it gets there. And that in and of itself can be a discussion point, right? So I think that's something we have to have understanding about. I think it's easy to say, why don't you understand us? Why don't you see our point of view? Well, that's difficult to do if you don't understand or don't have the experience or don't have anything more than the usual memes or the concepts around, oh, well, the Welsh people have a lot of sheep, blah, 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 and that kind of stuff. Oh, they have a dragon on their flag, or they're good at singing, or they like rugby, or, the football team in Wrexham is currently owned by a couple of North American actors. That all of that kind of stuff is just the stereotype stuff. It's not really down deep an understanding of the problems or of just general experiences of most people. And it's easy to fall into that trap because you don't necessarily know what's going on there. They don't necessarily know that Wales has issues that go beyond that are important to it in ways that aren't experienced the same in England, especially in South England. I would argue that there's a lot of similarities to some of what's going on. I would say some, I wouldn't say all, between North England and Wales and to a lesser extent, Scotland, and to some extent, Northern Ireland. But all of those areas have their own issues, and they're in some cases completely different. Like Scotland has oil, Wales does not. Wales has a lot of other methods and economic levers that are different than, say, England. And England has different economic levers and the functions of power that are far more vast than what Wales has, and Northern Ireland, and even Scotland. So they have a lot of control because of that. And it's not to say that they should be sensitive, but there should be some sort of cognizant understanding of that, and a acceptance that may or may not be looked on with an ideal point of view, and that the nations within the United Kingdom consistently have debated all through, to the point where Northern Ireland was divided into Northern Ireland because of the debate about how much control the center part of the United Kingdom is by England. And very similar to the way our experience in Canada, as an example, gets dominated by cultural influences of the United States, of the politics of the United States. Largely, if you see something in the United States politically, you can almost guarantee eventually it's going to come up here. Or I know some political people have used our politics as a way to fight their problems, or what they perceive as their problems. I'm not going to go into details on this. I don't think it's worth traveling down that path, but understand that some of that does go on. Each side, on all sides, chooses to fight battles in Canada because it's easier to fight the battle in Canada or learn from the battle in Canada and reuse it in America. And I know of at least 3 different instances where that very much is the case, so much so that there's been talk about the influence of other countries in Canadian politics, to the point where there's been backlash over all of the various influences that have gone on here. So it's a continual battle over, how much influence should X country have. And I'm not even talking about America at this point. There's more than just a debate about the Americans. There's debates about several different countries. And that kind of conflict is something that is so specific to Canada and so difficult to understand if you don't live here. So I can remember having a debate with a couple of American friends of mine about the usefulness or the reason why Canada has a queen, and at that time, and a king now, as our head of state. What was the point of it? Why did we have it? They didn't understand why we kept the trappings of the United Kingdom still in our country. And it's hard to explain when you sound like them, when you wear the same clothes, when you do the same sort of things, to explain to them that, yeah, that doesn't mean we're the same. And that not everything we do is what you do, and not everything you do is what we do. And while, yeah, it looks similar, it doesn't mean similar. And I think that's where stuff is broken down over the years. I think it's just simply the fact that there's this concept that we're just the same, we're brothers and or cousins, if you want to use that word. And the fact that we have interrelated people also, again, going back to the Welsh English example, where there's enough people that were born in the other side that have moved to the other country, and people just assume that over time it's the same, and it's trying to explain that there's a load of experience that goes along with this, and they aren't the same. And one of my favorite explanations for all of this is built around the concepts that are going on in 2025 around, whether Canada should become a part of the United States. And I am not getting into the politics or the person involved in this, so don't worry. We're not going to talk about that. That's not what this episode is for. But that discussion point has gone on since basically the War of Independence. This is nothing new. It's just new to a lot of people. But it's not new, and it certainly isn't new to Canada. The reason why I think that this is a surprise to a lot of American people I know is that they don't understand that Canada has had this debate for centuries. It isn't just something that's popped up because someone said something about it. It's in the back of the minds of most people in Canada, probably from birth, not because they necessarily have experienced it, but rather because the culture of Canada is very much built around it. And the idea of not wanting to be the other side influences a lot of Canadians in ways that I don't think even Canadians understand. And I think that is very similar with the way the Welsh and the English deal with each other, because I think there is a lot of misunderstanding about how much the Welsh, especially the people I know who were born in Wales and lived in Wales their whole life, have experience with the language. There is a feeling of separation that I don't think is fully understood on the other side of the border. And I think that is part of the issue between both sides, right? So, oh, it's just a Welsh problem. Oh, it's just the Welsh being silly. And as a Canadian, it's the kind of thing you hear quite frequently is that, well, it's an American thing. It's the opposite argument almost. It's like we talk a lot about American style fill in the blank, and it ain't donuts. It's like their politics. It's like their healthcare system. It's guns. It's all sorts of stuff. And it's always coming up in Canadian discussions, and it's negative largely. Like nobody talks about American style healthcare and goes, we want that. Nobody goes, we want American style gun control. We want when that word is used, it's used as a negative. So understand that. And for my own ancestors, who half of which are Welsh and came over just before, well, actually at the beginnings of the Great Depression, there's a whole different experience for them than my mother's side of the family, where some of them actually moved up from the United States to get away from the United States, who were loyal to the empire versus the local inhabitants who were loyal to the independence of America. And they didn't move up to Canada just because they wanted to get free land. They moved up to Canada because they wanted to get away from Americans. And that mindset is in the psyche of Canada, even in ways that, like I said, I don't even think Canadians understand fully. I think we think we do. I don't think we do, because well, you see it in the backlash, right? In the backlash that's going on in Canada right now is coming from not just one thing, it's a bunch of stuff. And I think it's coming in part because viscerally there's still this sense of we don't want to be you. And it's not just, you know, it's not like Ukraine and Russia where there was like, let's go to war and take this land back. It's more just the fact that there's been this built up sense of we are the same, but we're different. And all the conflict is around that. But it's an emotional conflict. It's a verbal conflict. It's, again, if you get past the stereotype, what is a Canadian? Especially if you're not from Canada. So, again, I don't want to make this a Canadian thing, but if you're talking about it from the Welsh standpoint, I think it's sort of a similar idea. There's a deeper sense of alienation going on with how Wales is working within the United Kingdom than I think people fully understand. And it's seen its outgrowth in the popularity of movements against England, be it Plaid Cymru, in the developments politically, or in the terrorism that used to go on before, in the anti English sentiment, especially around people vacationing and buying up homes in Wales, and how much that's affecting the local community and economy, and how that's driving a lot of negative viewpoint in ways that I think aren't fully understood by those same English people who are doing this, not perceiving it necessarily as being a displacement of the current people or a economic problem, and getting confused as to why they're being blamed for it. All of this kind of stuff is hard to explain to someone who isn't experiencing it, who doesn't live it, who doesn't feel it. And even amongst the people that live there, they themselves may not even be able to explain everything about it. We struggle with this. Like I said, when you talk about Canada, I can't tell you why viscerally we're like this. I can't, as someone who's lived in Wales for a number of years, tell you why every Welsh person feels the way they do or don't. Some are super positive towards English things. Some are super much in, a part of waving the Union Jack, celebrating the king when they come and queen when they come to visit. Their belief in the system that the United Kingdom has presented them is strong. But there are other people who feel isolated and put down by the system, who feel that their voice is not heard, that their representation is not heard, that their language is not heard because of that. And those people are much different than, say, an English person who visits Wales in the summer during the break for school. And they won't necessarily see a positive in that development. And I think the economy is definitely part of that, but I also think society is also another part of that. And building our understanding so that every side knows and can relate to the other, I think is an impossibility. We just don't live in a world where that's going to happen. I don't know how you could anyway. I could never understand the viewpoint of somebody who lives in Alabama any more than they can understand the viewpoint of us. And I don't think that that changes if I live in Essex or in Narvin. We have different experiences, different things we're doing and seeing and dealing with. And so it's hard to, even in the best of times, understand. But I think it's incumbent on us to at least try to do our best to be accommodating to others and their experiences, and understand we've traveled down a path I may regret doing. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about this experience, having lived in both areas and actually living in the United States and in England, and kind of seeing the obverse, where in the case of England, I remember somebody telling me one time, why would you want to move to Wales? Their economy is worse. This is worse. This is worse. Da, 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 da. And I was like, that's not the point. And I think that at the end of the day, that's kind of the argument I have on a number of fronts for a number of people, is that just because you see the negatives doesn't mean everybody does. Just because you see all the positives doesn't mean everybody does. For every positive There may be a negative, and that's important. And I see that as, and I see that, and you stop wiggling. And I see that as important to understand because it made it easier to explain. So when I talk to my American friends, when I talk to English people about Wales or my American friends about Canada, I'm not sitting there looking down on them, but more like, okay, let me try to explain this in a way that you'll understand, right? Because I've talked to a load of people in various countries about my country and about Wales and why, because people go, why are you doing this when you're from here, and trying to explain more than just, well, my family is from there. It's more than that. So you're trying to explain that. And then you try and explain what's the difference between these places. And that becomes a whole new conversation. But it's not done from the aspect of like ridiculing them, but done from an aspect of like trying to explain. And I think in that sense, that's the difference between having a conversation with someone and having a social media debate with someone, where there is no such thing as context, where there is no such thing as a conversation. It's all about you're right, I'm wrong, and you're not pulling me away from my opinion. With all that said and done, I hope you guys all have a great day. I hope you can't hear the noise in the background, but we'll see. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, of course, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. Love to hear from you. I try to respond as much as I can. If I don't, just tag me again. Sometimes I don't catch things, or I'm caught up with work or other things, and then just kind of slips my mind. So I don't try to avoid that, but if you're reaching out to me on social media, you can reach out to me through most social media sites at Welsh History Pod. If you are on Facebook, you can always join the group on facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. Or if you feel so inclined, you can help the podcast through our Patreon page at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you to all of those who do. Much appreciated as always. I hope you guys are all having a great day. And regardless of what's going on in your lives and the politics and all the other stuff, I do hope you have a wonderful week. We'll catch you later. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.